Here's a fun fact. The first quote-unquote real metalworking tool that I ever bought was a welder. It was one of those green Harbor Freight stick welders. I still have that welder, and all of the welding that I have done up to this point has been with that welder. In fact, this metal workbench that you see in most of my videos, it was made entirely with that welder. And you might be fooled into thinking that because a welder is a tool that I've had the longest, that I might be pretty good at it. But you would be wrong. It takes a lot of skill and a lot of finesse to be a good stick welder. Now, I'm not saying that MIG welding is easy, but what I am saying is it certainly looks a lot easier than stick welding. And for that reason, I have always wanted to try MIG welding, the so-called hot glue gun of the metal world. However, I've just never been able to justify the cost to get a MIG welder that would do all the things that I wanted it to do. Now, I don't have a long list of demands. I would want it to be 240 volt because welding on 110 is kind of pointless. I would want it to do both flux core and gas, and preferably have some sort of digital power control because it's 2024. Which is why when Best Arc reached out and asked if I wanted to check out their sub $200 MIG welding that had all those features, I said, yeah, I'll take a look. All right, so like I said, this is the Best Arc MIG 145 9 Gen. I guess that means the 9th generation of this machine. It is 110 or 220 volt. It can do gas and gasless MIG, apparently lift TIG, and stick welding. All right, so real quick, I'll just go through everything that comes in the box. Of course, you have the welder itself. The MIG gun seems to be permanently attached. You have your clamp for stick welding and the ground clamp, which, I mean, you know, certainly not the beefiest ground clamp that I've ever seen, but less than 200 bucks, I guess. What do you expect? This is going to be the gas tube for if you want to hook up gas. There is an adapter to convert from 240 volt to 110. The 240 volt adapter is what's already attached to the machine out of the box. There's what looks like a little shoulder strap. This thing is tiny, so I don't know. I guess they're thinking you're gonna walk around and weld with this thing strapped on your shoulder. There are 2 rolls of wire that come with the box, 0.8 millimeter solid core and a 1.0 millimeter flux core. And there's some extra tips for the MIG gun. It looks like an extra roller and some of this tape to put on your connectors for if you're hooking up the gas. First impressions, just taking it out of the box. The welder itself is, I mean, it's a tiny little thing. We'll take a closer look at this in just a minute. And everything smells very strongly of cheap rubber and plastic. But let's get it set up and see whether or not it welds, because if it does, maybe it doesn't matter how it smells. All right, first things first, the cord that is connected to this thing is, I think it's often called a dryer cord or a stove cord. It's just your typical 240 volt connector. You'll often find them connected to, you guessed it, dryers and electric stoves, that sort of thing, which is fine. I actually have one of these installed already because it is the same connector that's used on my other welder. However, the length of cord that they give you, it's just not very long. I mean, that's maybe 4 feet, and it's permanently connected. So if you did want to swap this cable out, it's not going to be as straightforward as simply unplugging this one and plugging in something different. You're going to have to take this thing apart at least a little bit and get into the machine to disconnect this one and then connect a new one. Side note, here is the gas connection, by the way. Not that we're going to be using it because I don't have gas, but there it is. It exists. To load the wire, you just undo these little clips here and then lift up this lid. As you can see, it is definitely designed to take these smaller little mini rolls of wire, and there is no way to adjust this to accept the more standard larger rolls of MIG wire, which to me is honestly, I don't know, a little disappointing, I guess. It is a tiny little machine, so maybe I just need to adjust my expectations, but I did just kind of expect that it would at least be able to accommodate a normal sized roll of wire, and it definitely cannot. All right, here is a look at the control panel. Honestly, there's not really a lot going on here. It looks like there's a bunch of different buttons, but really they all just have a single functionality. So starting in the top left here, this button is where you choose between the different behaviors of your torch trigger. There are two options for this. The first option is labeled 2T. This is your standard behavior. Pull the trigger to start welding, let it go to stop. And then underneath of that is labeled 4T. This is a little bit weird. In this setting, if you pull the trigger once, it will start welding, let go of the trigger and it will continue welding, and then pull the trigger a third time to make it stop. Moving clockwise in the top right, this button here just changes between gas and gasless welding modes. You will notice though that as I cycle between gas and gasless, the options that I get down here for this button in the bottom left corner are also going to change. This button here is where you choose between different thicknesses of welding wire. In gas welding mode, I only have one option, and that's for 30 thousandths of an inch welding wire. In gasless mode, I can choose between 30 thousandths, 35 thousandths, and 40 thousandths of an inch welding wire. Moving over to the knob in the middle, this is obviously your power setting. You can go from right around 16 volts, 50 amps, all the way up to, I think, 21 volts, 145 amps. You'll also notice that as I change to different wire thicknesses, those power settings are going to change as well. And then the last button on the bottom right here is where you change between the different types of welding. You have MIG, TIG, and MMA, which is stick, I guess, for options. If you change to anything except for MIG, all of the other options around the sides here will go away and you are just left with your power control. One option that you may notice is missing here, and that is the wire speed settings. This thing has what they are calling synergic control. You saw a little bit of this when switching between the different wire thicknesses. You can see some power settings change. The other setting that this will handle is the wire speed. So basically what the book says is that this thing will set the speed of your wire feed based off of whatever wire thickness and power settings you're using. So I guess we'll have to see how well that actually works. I guess the last thing to mention as far as the settings go is the electrode. I already mentioned earlier that the MIG gun does come pre-attached and it is permanently attached to the machine. And then there's this little jumper pigtail thing that sticks out of the bottom of the machine here. This is connected to the electrode for the MIG gun. So in order to change the MIG gun between DC positive and negative, you just switch this little jumper to either the positive or negative port. For gasless flux core welding, they say to use DC electrode negative. So I'm just going to connect this thing to the negative port, and then I'll connect my ground clamp to the positive port, and we should be good to go. So everything is connected and I think I'm pretty much ready to start welding. But before I do that, I just wanted to show you something real quick. I already mentioned the power cord, which is of course now connected to the wall, and as you can see, it is stretched all the way out and I'm using every last inch of it just so that I can get this thing to sit on my bench, which really is not that far from my wall. And here's the MIG gun lead, which itself is only about 6 foot long. So you're not really getting a lot of room to stretch out here. Now this is definitely a small machine, so maybe this isn't a big deal. And given the price of this thing, I definitely don't want to start nitpicking. However, this is something you're going to have to think about every time you use the machine, so I figure it's at least worth mentioning. Okay, I've got a few random bits and bobs of cheap mild steel here. This is all just tubing and cut up angle iron with a range of wall thicknesses from what looks to be about 1/16 of an inch to right around 1/8 of an inch, and the thickest is I think about 1/4 of an inch. And I guess what I'll do is just start trying to stick stuff together. We'll see how and if this thing actually works. But before we even get started, I just want to make one more disclaimer and say, I am not a good welder. This is not a how to weld video. You're not going to get any tips and tricks, and I've never used a MIG welder in my life. So let's keep that in perspective here. However, with that being said, make sure to comment below and remind me how awful I am. All right, so I could probably stand here the rest of the day sticking random bits of metal together. Arguably, I probably should just for the practice, but that is not why we're here today. Today, we are here to take a look at this cheap little Amazon welder, pass judgment, and decide its fate. To those ends, I, of course, checked out the MIG welding because it's a MIG welder, and I figured while I was at it, I might as well try a little stick welding as well, so I did some of that too. And before I even launch into a monologue, let me just show you the results I was getting. We'll start off with the MIG welds, and just try and remember here that I am not a good welder, so do your best to differentiate between the capabilities of the machine and the skill of the operator. This is MIG weld number 1. Again, keeping in mind that this is the very first time that I have ever had a MIG gun in my hands. So there is MIG weld number 1. MIG weld number 2, this one is the result of 2 passes. So there's a root pass underneath here and then a second pass where I just kind of swiped back and forth. And I think this one came out, fairly decent, all things considered. Moving on to the stick welds, this is weld number 1, and I think you can probably see that I was struggling here. I couldn't get the arc to start, and then once it did start, I was having a really hard time holding it, and I was starting to get frustrated until I remembered that I was using cheap Harbor Freight electrodes. So before I gave up on the machine and blamed the machine for this, I decided to switch electrodes and try with something a little bit better, which brings us to weld number 2. This is all the same settings, but instead of a Harbor Freight electrode, this is using a Hobart 6011 electrode. This one went much better. The arc started right up. I didn't have any problems holding it. And, quite honestly, this weld went really smooth, and I was pretty happy with how this one went. So what are my final thoughts on this thing? Well, it works. It'll stick 2 pieces of metal together, and as long as you use a decent weld medium, it seems to do a perfectly acceptable job. It's also very easy to use. The controls are super simple, but again, because of that, it's very easy to use. It isn't complicated. The synergic control for the MIG gun, it seems to do what it's supposed to do. You don't get a lot of control, but again, it's simple and it works. It'll run on both 110 and 220, which I know for a lot of people is probably a bonus. However, I will say that if you're looking to get a welder, no matter what level of commitment or how much welding you want to do, if you are just thinking that you want to get a welder and you're going to weld something, install a 220 volt outlet. It's not hard and it's absolutely worth it. The difference between trying to weld on 110 versus 220, it's absolutely night and day. So that's my 2 cents on that. But it will run on 110, and I know for some people that's probably going to be important. I also do like the fact that you can both stick and MIG weld with this, because I do think that stick welding, if you're going to learn to weld, is worth learning. So I like that. I like that it can do both. Build quality is, it's what you'd expect. It's a sub $200 Amazon welder. It's not built like a tank, but it's not going to fall apart either. It's, it's fine. It's, like I said, exactly what you'd expect. So what are the downsides? Well, again, it's a sub $200 Amazon inverter welder, right? So it does what it's supposed to do, but you're not getting flexibility, customizability, power, and control here. This goes back to that synergic control. It pretty much does what it does, and if that's good enough, then that's good enough, but it's not, then there's nothing you can really do. It's got this short lead that's permanently attached, so it's not like you're going to upgrade this thing with a better MIG gun in the future. I think it really boils down to the fact that when you pull this thing out of the box, it does whatever it does, and that's it. So I guess, you know, if a person was just looking for something to stick relatively small pieces of metal together and they wanted to spend as little money as possible, then a machine like this would probably do just fine. However, on the other hand, if a person were really looking to get into welding and they wanted something to get started with so that they could practice, develop their skills, and grow into the future, then unfortunately, this just isn't the machine for that. It isn't going to have the power, the flexibility, and the control that that person is going to need. Again, this machine is for the person who just needs something that they can pull out of the box, plug in, push the trigger, and then move on to the next thing. And I guess that pretty much wraps it up for this one. If you have made it this far into the video, thank you so very much for watching. I do truly appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one very, very soon.